Our forum tonight will attempt to highlight the differences among these four candidates in the areas of the economy, foreign policy, social policy, and the environment. Tonight's debate is a somewhat unusual one with fewer rules and fewer time constraints than in past debates. The candidates will take turns starting certain new topics, and they will have time for closing remarks, but other than that, they are free to question each other, to challenge each other, to react to each other's remarks. Now, the League is having timekeepers ensure that by the end of this hour, every candidate will have an equal time to talk. Let me introduce the candidates to you. On my left is Mr. James Shannon, United States Representative to Congress from the 5th Congressional District. Next to him, Mr. Michael Conley, Secretary of State to the Commonwealth. Then, Mr. John Kerry, the present Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts. And finally, Mr. David Bartley, former Speaker of the Massachusetts House of Representatives. Gentlemen, welcome. With so many choices for the voters on the Democratic ballot, the differences amongst you often become blurred. And so tonight, instead of focusing on the issues on which you agree, such as a mutual verifiable nuclear freeze, let us consider some other aspects of arms control. Defense, at least today, seems to have become a religious issue. Today, 18 bishops of the Catholic Church in New England have issued a statement including arms control and disarmament as one of the primary issues for voters. And yet, President Reagan tells us just the opposite. Speaking before a group of veterans yesterday, he said we have a moral responsibility to build a defense against nuclear weapons. Clearly, these are different interpretations, moral interpretations on defense. To what degree is defense a moral issue? And by order of the draw, Mr. Shannon, we begin with you.
Well, I suppose that it's natural that religious leaders and others who are concerned about peace would take an interest in what kind of defense policy that we have, and I think it is very much a moral issue, particularly when we're spending so much of our resources in developing weapons that could literally destroy the world. And so I applaud the bishops for taking their stand on this issue, and think that all of us should. I encourage other religious leaders to take a stand on this issue. We in the United States, I think, have a particular responsibility because we're the ones who invented nuclear weapons. We've been building them up dramatically in the last few years. We have a particular responsibility to take the lead in reversing the arms race, and that's why I called for the United States to take action, as we did in 1963. To stop the atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons, to take action, give the Soviets a chance to respond, see whether we can stop the testing, deployment, and production of nuclear weapons, and give the Soviets an ample time to respond. I think it's a pressing moral question. I think it's one that the American people shouldn't avoid in this election year.
And yet whom, if it is a moral issue, whom are the people to believe? The President is telling them one thing, the bishops of New England another.
But initially, Mary, I just have to take question relative to the whole issue of the nuclear freeze. As a United States Senator, I would make the opening remark that I would serve in stark contrast to Senator Ted Kennedy, and that's not to be critical. Senator Kennedy serves three constituencies. He serves a worldwide, nationwide, and statewide constituency. The main thrust of my candidacy and my tenure in the Senate would be to serve the people here in Massachusetts. They would be my #1 priority. But unlike Jim Shannon and John Kerry, they support a unilateral nuclear freeze. In fact, when asked by Freeze Voter 84 where they stood on the issue of what nuclear weapons would they support prior to a freeze, they said they would vote against every nuclear weapon, Trident, Cruise, Pershing, Midget Man, right down the line. I support a bilateral, mutually verifiable nuclear freeze. And I believe that on-site inspection is critical as a part of that. And I believe that that is a major difference between myself and the other two candidates.
Let me, if I can intercede, Mary, here. I think that it is perfectly appropriate, first of all, for the bishops to speak out on that or on any other issue. But it's critical that we as Senate candidates and we as a people in this country begin to confront the issue of morality of nuclear weapons. We are about to embark on a transition in the whole level of nuclear warfare which is different from anything that we've ever known on Earth before. And I believe that the morality, the question of morality, of taking from Earth into outer space our earthly weapons of destruction rises to the highest level of question. And unless we confront that now, we stand at risk to lose the opportunity to ever confront it. And I think that is the height of what this race is about. Will we or won't we as a nation gain control over our destiny? And I'll tell you something. Star Wars is not a defensive system. Because if you can build a system that can knock down every weapon that is sent at you, you in fact have developed impregnability. And if you're impregnable, you have a first strike capacity. So it's a threatening system, and a system which is guaranteed to have the Soviet Union build the same thing. We must fight it.
Let me ask you this. Do you accept Mr. Connolly's interpretation of your position on the freeze as being close to unilateral?
No, absolutely, categorically not. Mr. Connolly is wrong. I am not in favor of a unilateral freeze. I am in favor of a step by the United States, the Nuclear Arms Moratorium Act, where we would take and put in place a temporary moratorium on the testing and deployment, just as John Kennedy did in 1963, and ask the Soviet Union to follow us.
At this point in the history of Massachusetts, 1 out of 4 jobs is defense-related. All of you have, to some degree or another, recommended deep cuts in high-technology weapons programs. This, of course, is going to have a serious impact on the economy of Massachusetts. How do you balance the needs of this citizenry with the desire for arms control?
Well, I think that we have to have arms control, and I think that we do support arms control, and I have always supported arms control, but there is a difference. And in the Freeze 84 voter questionnaire, both of our 2 liberal colleagues said that they would favor really unilateral disarmament, because they were asked questions whether they would be in favor of modernization of nuclear weapons before a freeze, and they answered no. Now, all of us oppose the MX, the B-1, the Star Wars project, and all of us say that we can save $50 billion in terms of dollars cut out of the military budget that are crucial to another issue concerned here, and that is with the budget deficit. But I think there's a clear difference in saying that you're for a unilateral disarmament and you're for a unilateral freeze, which is what the 2 liberal colleagues on this panel have said. That's an essential difference.
David, the only system that you won't build, that I won't build, that you will, is the Trident submarine. It's the only one that we won't build. Now, let me ask you a question.
No, John, that's not true. You answered the question that you were against modernization, John, of all of our weapon systems.
David, how many Trident submarines do we have today?
John,
how many answer my question.
No, John, the issue is not the specific questions.
Yes, it is.
No, it's not.
The
issue is, do you favor modernization? And of course, you want it to stray.
How many Trident submarines do we have?
John.
All right, since we reached a stalemate over here, Mr. Shannon,
I think that there's a larger point that goes beyond this question of military contracts or specific questions of strategic weapons, which are important questions, of course. The larger point is, when is the United States going to assume the lead in bringing the world toward peace? Are we going to sit here for the rest of our time as candidates, and is our nation going to continue on its present course and sit on its hands and say to the Soviet Union, you won't budge, so we won't budge? The result of that will be a continuation of this arms race, and the result of that could be a nuclear confrontation. The question is, do we have the greatness, and do we have the vision, and do we have the will, and do we have the courage to stand up as a nation and say, we're willing to take that first step? And I believe that we should, and I believe that the United States Senate can play a very important role in moving this country in that direction. I've been in Washington for 6 years, and I've heard all of these arguments for standing pat, for not taking action. I'm convinced that we've got parity with the Soviet Union. I'm convinced that we've got a defense which is second to none. I've heard generals and admirals testify to that effect. They've said that they wouldn't swap our defense for that of the Soviet Union.
By order of the draw, Mr. Connolly.
And I believe we should be willing to take that step.
By order of the draw, Mr. Connolly gets the next question on foreign policy. Of course, foreign policy is much more than spending or simply not spending money on defense. As a senator, you are going to have to decide whether it is appropriate to send military aid, to send advisors, weapons, perhaps even combat troops to the increasing number of world hotspots. How do you make such decisions?
You make such fundamental decisions relative to where you believe our vital interests exist. But significantly, the last thing that we want to do is commit American fighting men anywhere in the world, whether it be in Central America or in the Mideast. I think everyone realizes and recognizes the catastrophe that took place in Lebanon. I think that throughout this entire process, I think that there are a number of things that we should do, and that is the cornerstone of our foreign policy should truly be human rights. And as we deal with those countries in Central America, we should consistently insist upon no human rights violations, but we should be willing to provide economic aid in terms of medical aid, food. We should be willing to go in and provide educational aid where it's necessary. In fact, we should ask students to come from Central America and attend our universities and colleges here in the United States. But lastly, I would like to sum up again. Do not make a mistake on this. The so-called liberal twins in this particular fight gave away the store as it related to the nuclear freeze. They were not addressing a moratorium on nuclear disarmament for a period of 6 months. They said that they would vote against all nuclear weapons.
You're out of time on that question. John, you're trying to get...
Kerry, I'd like to, you know, the real problem, I heard Jimmy talk about Washington. Washington is the problem here. Let me quote something that Senator Moynihan wrote about the MX vote. He said, "The outcome was not decided by argument. It was decided by routine. The routine that Congress never in the end refuses a president a new weapons system. What was lacking was a sufficiently compelling sense of the principles that were at stake. There was a catatonic quality to the decision to deploy the MX, an absence of will. We were making perhaps the most fatal mistake in our history, but I spoke to a body that could not remember what it was doing that was different." Washington is the problem here, and you've got to send somebody down to Washington who is going to change the way we think about nuclear war, about parity, and about our capacity to change our defensive posture against the Soviet Union and other countries.
Mary, there is no one that is against any kind of peace. And of course, whether you're a Washington insider, as one candidate is trying to say, or a Washington outsider, as the other candidate is trying to say, the issue is that for the freeze voter 1984, two candidates gave away the store in advance. Their position is not the position of the Democratic Party. Their position is not the position of Ted Kennedy, Paul Tsongas, or Walter Mondale. Their position is the far left fringe, so they could curry favor with the Freeze 84 and get their endorsement, which of course that they do have. Everybody wants a mutually verifiable nuclear freeze. No one's talking about building the MX, the B-1, or the Star Wars project. We're talking about keeping the cruise missile. We're talking about the Trident submarine. We're talking about at least having a safe America, which is really all that we're looking for.
What about it? Have you given away the store?
Well, Mary, would you like me to answer your original question or answer the question that we've revolved around to?
Do you want to take time, since you have been called one of the liberal twins and you've been...
Yeah, I want to make a couple of points, I guess. As we're not giving away the store. We're building up the stores of nuclear weapons that are being deployed in this world. And we've got to stop it. We've got to have the guts to stand up and reverse that trend someday. And that's why I've fought on the floor of the House of Representatives to kill the MX missile and for nuclear freeze. And we've had some success after long battles in those areas. But as to your original question, when should we send military assistance? I think that is a very fundamental question because it really goes to how much we're going to spend on national defense. If we define our national interests as being threatened by 2.7 million Nicaraguans, or if we define our national interests as being closely allied with the Marcos government in the Philippines, or the need to send Marines into Lebanon, then of course we're going to continue to spend too much of our resources on national defense.
Jim, let me ask
I believe that we don't have a national interest in those areas, that we're not threatened, we don't have to have a paranoid foreign policy, and if we redirected foreign policy and had a less interventionist foreign policy, we'd spend an awful lot less of our resources on national defense.
What about the invasion of Grenada? What's your stance and position relative to the invasion?
I oppose the invasion of Grenada. I think it was a mistake. I think it was a lawless act. I think it invited lawless acts by other countries, and I didn't support that. I spoke against that on the floor of the House of Representatives.
Mary, you spoke earlier of the economic conversion factor, and that is when we are successful in terms of cutting the military budget and bringing this $300 billion white elephant under control on one level and cutting it by $50 billion and still maintaining a strong defense that will hold up worldwide. Where do we find the new jobs? Where's the jobs? Because right now, up in Wilmington, they're building the guidance systems for MX missiles. Specifically, we just had Japan transport $300 million worth of subway cars across the Pacific Ocean to New York City, and now they're online in New York. Beyond that, we have a number of situations where we could use guidance systems as being built by that very same firm in Wilmington for the Red Line. And the GE plant in Lynn is certainly capable.
Put the MX on the red line.
We should put the MX on the red line.
Mary.
And no one will be able to find the missile.
That's right.
But within that particular process, there is job conversion to be made. And we can do it. And we can make certain that we have full employment here in Massachusetts. And we have to protect our mature industries as well, whether it be tools, whether it be textiles, whether it be plastics, whether it be the fishing industry itself. We need to be able to go out and make certain that all of those industries are able to increase employment over the next years instead of losing it.
No one wants an adventuresome foreign policy that we're talking before, but I have a boy who's 18 or 19 years old, eligible to serve in the Army. He also could have been in Grenada as one of the students. And I think that the President of the United States was fearful of the children's lives, and that's why he went to Grenada. And I don't think that we can second guess that particular type of action on the part of the President. No one likes to see Americans go invading anywhere, and of course we didn't want them in Lebanon.
Let's not second guess him. Let's jump ahead of him and stop the policy before he does it in Nicaragua and El Salvador and around the world.
I don't think nobody's asking him to do that, Jim. But they thought American lives were being threatened, and if my 19-year-old son was down there, I sure would be delightful.
Phony rationalization.
Well, I don't think so, Jim, because every one of those kids that came back, they thought that their lives were being threatened as well.
No, David,
and it's easy to sit back.
Every one of
well,
those kids
90% of them, John, that I saw on the television. I'm glad you found one that didn't.
There's one in Worcester, and I know that there are several who came back and said the first threat they felt was when the American bombs started dropping. That was when they got scared.
We're out of time on this segment. We're going to have to turn to the economy. In 1980, what a switch. In 1980, Ronald Reagan asked that now famous question. He asked the voters whether they were better off than they were 4 years ago. The Massachusetts economy is better off than it was 4 years ago. Unemployment is now at a 14% low. Inflation is down. The picture is pretty rosy. Don't the Republicans deserve some credit for this? And why should the voters choose a Democratic senator? Wouldn't they be better off having a Republican in the Senate working with a Republican administration? And by order of the draw, Mr. Kerry, the question goes to you.
No, they absolutely wouldn't be better off, because at very least the presence of a Republican in the Senate will mean Jesse Helms, should Reagan win again and the Senate not be Democratic, Jesse Helms at the Foreign Relations Committee, the lack of chairmanship of the Judiciary Committee, and a host of relationships would be different, appointments to the Supreme Court. I think they would not be better off on that alone. But apart from that, if you look today that people have more money in their pocket, inflation is down, and unemployment is down, yes, we can celebrate and have a sense of well-being about ourselves and our country. But that's not the issue. Where are we going to be in 2 years? Where are we going to be in 5 years and 10 years? And I don't think this country is better off. We've stepped back on women's rights, we've stepped back on daycare, we've stepped back on civil rights, we've stepped back on education, on transportation, on health care, on every single program of importance to human beings. We have a long-term deficit problem that is going to catch up to us.
We're going to pay the price of that. Back to the issue of the economy. Are we not better off, Mr. Bartlett?
Let's talk about the economy. I had the privilege of being the Secretary of Administration and Finance in Massachusetts, where we balanced the budget, where we left a $42 million surplus. We sent more money back to cities and towns than had ever been sent back to them before. We took an attitude of being pro-business, which was pro-people at the particular time. And I think that Governor King and David Bartley ought to get a substantial amount of credit for that 3.9 unemployment picture, because of decisions that we made 18 months ago on balancing the budget. There's nothing wrong with balancing the budget and cutting taxes. Jack Kennedy did it in 1962. It's not a Republican issue. The Democrats can manage the economy. We've proved it. I proved it as Secretary of Administration and Finance, and I proved it when I was Speaker of the House during the 1970s. Goodness, why do we hand that issue of managing the economy to the Republicans? I think that the Democrats did very well in doing it here in this state, and did very well in 1962. That's why I'm the only one of these 4 people that said that we can not raise taxes in 1985, and we don't have to do it.
Miri, we had a situation, and that is we have 4% unemployment in the state right now overall, but we still have areas of this state that suffer from sharp unemployment. We have the area of Fitchburg, Lawrence, Taunton, Fall River. They're experiencing unemployment rates to the degree of 15%. And unlike my colleagues who have run a blue suit campaign, I have taken my campaign to the working men and women of this Commonwealth in what I call the Workday program. I take a vacation day as Secretary of the Commonwealth, and over the last 11 weeks I've worked 11 different jobs. I've taught in a high school in Boston. I made shoes in a shoe factory in the city of Haverhill for 8 hours. I worked in a paper mill in Pittsfield. I went to the docks of New Bedford and offloaded a fishing boat. I was a policeman in the town of Shrewsbury. And last Friday, I worked in a hazardous waste treatment plant in the town of Framingham for 8 hours. And believe me, you should know that subject from the bottom up. And in the case of the shoe workers in Haverhill, the situation is that absent import quotas in every country, every Western democracy, whether it be France, Great Britain, Spain, Italy, Japan, all have import quotas on foreign shoes, except us. And those individuals would come to me directly and say, absent import quotas on this level, we won't have a job in 3 years. Certainly not in 5 years. And that's been one of the great failures of the Congress of the United States. You want to know why? Because there are 10,000 people who want to work those jobs and will potentially lose them.
All of you have supported domestic content legislation to some degree, and yet some analysts say that in the auto industry, for example, that legislation alone would be responsible for adding $1,000 to the price of every car, which in the long run, of course, will hurt the auto industry. At what point does government intervention, of which you speak, become harmful?
Let me, if I can, since I didn't get a chance to get in my licks on the question, answer the previous question, then go to your question. You know, somebody said that the policy of this administration is that a rising tide lifts all yachts. And I think basically that's what they've done. They have lulled many people in this country into a sense of complacency by making others pay the bill. And what they have done is divided this country. Look at it. Families who earn under $30,000 have seen their federal taxes go up. The national deficit is $161 billion by the end of the decade they think they can achieve, and who are they going to make pay for it? Low-income people, people on AFDC, Medicare recipients. They've cut programs that have driven half of the households headed by women in this country into poverty. 1 out of 5 kids lives in poverty. The quality of education is going down. We're going to be a great nation by being together a great nation, not by making one segment of our population pay the bill. And that's why I don't think we're better off than we were 4 years ago, and we have to make some radically different policies, put them into effect in this country. Now, as to domestic content, I think that our trade policy has been a one-way street for altogether too long. We have let other countries play by a different set of rules than we have played by. And I think an element of protection used with discretion, at least a willingness to threaten protection, is absolutely necessary if we're going to be able to work out more favorable trade agreements with other nations, as we did with the Japanese. They voluntarily limited their export of automobiles to the United States because of domestic content legislation.
But Mary, on this particular issue, we are looking at...
Kerry's next.
Okay.
Well, I was just going to say, I'm interested to hear Jim talk about the inequities of the system and how it's been shifted from one side to another, because he sits on the Ways and Means Committee, and the Ways and Means Committee in Congress writes our tax law. And our tax law in the last few years has become an aberration, an abomination, if you will. In 1980, people at the poverty line with 4 kids paid $460 in taxes. Today, they pay $1,076 in taxes. And Mr. Shannon supported and says that he thinks it's a good idea to give a company like Mass Mutual Insurance, the second largest in our state, a $14 million break, while at the same time the Eastco Hand Tool Company in Springfield laid off 15% of its employees. I don't understand that kind of...
Well, John, let me explain it to you if I can, because the very bill that you have criticized, the Deficit Reduction Act, dealt with the problem of that family at the poverty line by expanding the earned income tax credit for low-income people. You said you'd vote against that. It expanded the child health assurance program. You said you'd vote against that. It expanded AFDC benefits. You said you'd vote against that. And let me say quite frankly here that one of our jobs as representatives and senators is to look out for Massachusetts' interests, broadly defined and narrowly defined. And if a business wants to come to me and can make a legitimate case that is going to be treated unfairly by any piece of tax legislation, They are welcome to come in my door, make that case, and if I can help them, I certainly will.
Let me answer that. Let me answer that if I may, because I think it's a
fight will
very
go on all
important
night
point.
between Mr. Shannon and
I think
Mr.
it's a
Kerry. They've been fighting it for
It's a very, very important
years.
point. I'll help any company in the state that needs help. But when you have a deficit reduction act with a $200 billion deficit, and you're supposed to be raising money to reduce the deficit, don't turn to the mutual-held insurance companies that have a higher tax rate than the stock-held companies and lower them. Turn to the stock-held companies and raise them to the level of the mutuals and raise the tax.
Mary, I appreciate very much their questions about taxes, but the issue is that there's one individual who doesn't want to raise any new taxes, and that's David Bartley. Now, we all know about the poor insurance companies, especially those life insurance companies. They really need help. All you people out there, you know how, you just look at those poor life insurance companies, they need help.
David, you don't want to raise taxes, but you want to raise aid to education, you want to entirely rebuild the infrastructure, you want to deal with hazardous waste, and you have a million other programs that will add billions of dollars to the state.
They won't add billions of dollars,
to the federal budget,
Michael.
but you have no new taxes.
Let me tell you how you do it, Michael. First of all, you can cut $50 billion out of the defense. You can hit the underground economy that's $100 billion. We've documented $200 billion worth of tax reduction. Jimmy came up with 35 or 40 more with closing some loopholes on some more companies. Now, wait a minute.
We are dealing with a $170 billion deficit.
You are correct. You are correct. But what I'm saying is that we can shift the priorities of spending, and we can do it for education without raising new taxes, Michael. You don't have to go in Walter Mondale's tank.
No one's in Walter Mondale's tank. We've had Mr. Shannon, Mr. Kerry, and Mr. Bartley speak. I'd like to have the opportunity to go back to the domestic content bill and just say that we are, from which this all flowed. And I do not believe that any individual can tell you that we will have no new taxes when we're dealing with a $170 billion deficit and we have problems such as hazardous waste, increased aid to education, an infrastructure that needs rebuilding at this moment in time. It's just absurd. It's where those monies come from, and we have to make certain that they don't come from the middle class in this society or the poor in this society. Domestic content. And the domestic content situation, we have the same approach that's being used right now for the steel industry, and that is we will now see import quotas on steel. The one thing that we have to guard against is we have to make certain that those new profits do not go into the pockets of the stockholders and the executives in those companies. We have to make certain that they are used to retool the steel factories in this country, to make them more competitive internationally. And the same applies with domestic content. There'll be new profits that the American automakers will realize, and we have to make certain that those go to retool and make certain we have the best technology in the world when we build an automobile. And that's domestic content.
Mr. Shannon, I'd like to ask you, you are the only one so far who has proposed new taxes, corporate taxes, which would raise $40 billion.
Call it the Shannon-Bartley plan.
Which Massachusetts corporations would be impacted by that plan?
All Massachusetts corporations would be impacted by that plan, and I don't think we should have any
Is that an anti-business stance?
illusions about that. No, because what's happened in the last several years is we've had a system put into place, which I opposed every step of the way, which has widely skewed effective tax rates. You have the Northrop Corporation that pays an effective tax rate of minus 100%. As a full subsidy. They're generating so much tax shelter that they can't use it all by 100%. And then you have DEC, on the other hand, that is paying a very high, 25, 30% effective tax rate relative to that. What we're saying is, let's neutralize that out. Let's not create a tax system where people have incentive to put their capital someplace because of the tax rate. That's resulting in a lot of speculation, a lot of, I think, unproductive use of capital. Let's have a tax system that will generate revenues to lower the deficit and pay for programs that need to be restored, that will be neutral and create a climate for growth, and that will assess those taxes on a progressive rate. And that's what we're trying to do, is make those who can best afford to pay. That's what my proposal does.
Why is it that will Mass Mutual come back up at that point in time?
Absolutely.
Well, why did we lower it in the first place?
Let me tell you something, John. I have a question for you.
Well,
why is it that
finish my
30,000 insurance jobs in Massachusetts less valuable than shipyard jobs or auto jobs or any other jobs.
They're not less valuable. They're not in jeopardy.
Why don't you,
That's the difference.
why don't you tell
They're
people,
not in
why don't you tell
jeopardy.
people in the audience how much Mass Mutual paid in federal taxes last year and how much they pay under the new bill?
Jimmy, nobody can tell how much they
I'll
pay
tell you
yet
how much
because
they paid
haven't
last
paid
year.
their taxes
They
yet.
paid $21 million last year, and they pay $64 million next year.
You can't tell
and I
how
don't
much-
consider that a break.
Jim, unless you have access to the boardroom that I don't have, it's impossible to tell.
I do.
Exactly, you do. I know you do. And that's exactly why I think I should go to the United States Senate and write
John,
the next tax law.
I think that if you want to be the senator from Massachusetts,
just
you have to
finish.
be willing to talk to
Let me just
business
finish.
leaders and labor leaders and League of Women Voters. And that's why I have the support of so many of those people around the state, because I have an open door. I'm accessible. I tell them when I agree with them and when I disagree with them.
You see,
and we
Jimmy,
have a very diverse state, John, with diverse interests, and we need a senator who is sensitive to those interests.
Jim,
as I think
I
I've proven I am.
understand very well the diversity of this state because I serve as its lieutenant governor, and I deal with all kinds of businesses on a constant basis. The difference is, I'm not going to help a life insurance company that's the second largest in the state, whose jobs are not being lost while they're laying off people at hand tool companies, while small businessmen are struggling to survive, while people can't put food on their table, while we're losing money
You know why
from the
those
women.
jobs
Let
won't
me
be
just
lost?
finish.
Those jobs
Please,
won't be
may I
lost when we
finish?
have
Please let
spokespeople
me
for
finish.
those interests in Washington,
Let me just finish.
as I have been.
Let me just finish. It's a question of priorities. Do you put women, infant, children nutrition programs ahead of life insurance companies? That's the issue. Now you're turning around 2 weeks before the election and proposing a major increase for corporations after, in 5.5 years, you never did it. You
As a
gave them
matter
break.
of fact,
We're out of time for that segment, and by order of the draw, the next question goes to Mr. Bartley. Let's get back to the development today, the statement by the Catholic bishops of New England. We talked about that statement in regard to the nuclear freeze, perhaps a more controversial position, at least amongst this panel, is their position on abortion. Every one of you, and I've heard you speak to this issue tonight, agrees that religious leaders have a right to speak out. You encourage them to speak out in a democracy. I'd like to ask you, is there a threshold beyond which it is inappropriate for a religious leader to speak out? Mr. Bartley?
I don't think that there's a threshold beyond which a religious leader can speak out. We've had a history and a tradition in this country of religious leaders participating in the government. We've had religious leaders who have served in Congress. We had a religious leader who ran for president of the United States, Jesse Jackson, in our party. There's nothing wrong with religious leaders speaking out. Politics and religious leaders have been entwined in the history of our country for years. And I think that when the bishops speak out on a nuclear freeze, that's their privilege. When they speak out on the issue of abortion, they have a perfect right to do it. We have always had this. We had religious leaders that served in the Massachusetts legislature with distinction. Almost every legislative body has some sort of a chaplain who sometimes looks out at its members and prays for the country, but one way or the other, they are there, and I think they have a perfect right to be there and a perfect right to speak out, and I hope more of them speak out on whatever issues they care to.
The significance of this statement today is that if you go back through the last 2 or 3 years, you will find that consistently, when the bishops spoke out on the issue of nuclear arms and the nuclear freeze, they were applauded by the liberal community in this state. Isn't this fantastic that they would take this stand? And they were constantly referenced as a guideline that they could, a beacon that could be followed on this particular issue. But when the bishops speak relative to the issue of abortion, the liberal community in this state stands up and says, now they're bringing religion into politics. And nothing could be more absurd. We're talking about an issue of life and death. We're not talking about a religious issue here. We're talking about a natural law, bringing about the end of destruction, the destruction of human life on all levels, as well as violence in our society. And they have every right to speak on that issue. And they should not be told to keep their place as it relates to the issue of abortion. They should be able to speak loud and clear on that particular issue. And I'm proud to say, as it relates to those two issues, that I was an early supporter of the nuclear freeze. In fact, my track record is better than the liberal twins is on this particular issue. And I'm also opposed to abortion, and I'm proud to state it as a stance that I've taken openly throughout this entire campaign.
Let me ask the two of our candidates then who might have trouble with the bishop's position on abortion. The bishops in their letter today rejected the argument which some politicians use that personal views on abortion should not affect public policy. They outright rejected that as an illogical and untenable argument. How do you deal with that? All four of you are practicing Catholics.
Well,
That's quite an assumption you make there.
Do you have anything to tell us, Mr. Conley?
No, I have nothing to tell you.
All right. Mr. Kerry?
having made the assumption, I think that the bishops have every right in the world, and I said this earlier today, to speak out on any subject whatsoever. In fact, they also have a moral obligation to do so. But I do think that whether or not an individual, as a matter of public policy, makes a decision that that is exactly the policy they are going to adhere to or not, is a matter that is up to that individual to decide. Logic is a matter for all of us as humans to make a decision about. One thing may be logical to one person and it may be illogical to another.
So you would at least disagree with that portion of the bishop's statement?
As to whether or not it is logical or not logical, I have a disagreement. That is correct.
I have a question for you, John, and that is, John, you have stated in a number of debates that you believe that life begins at conception, correct?
That's correct.
Yes. And you believe that it's an individual's choice to destroy that human life if they decide to do so?
No, Michael. You see, that's not what I believe. What I believe is that the notion that life begins at conception is, for me, an article of faith, a matter of religion. I can't prove it in a court of law. It is a matter of faith. And I cannot take my matter of faith and, as a matter of public law, transfer it to Protestant, Jew, atheist, or person who just doesn't share my article of faith.
Let's broaden this discussion to some other social issues, because there are so many to consider here. All of you, to some degree or another, support cleaning up the environment, aiding the poor, the elderly, the handicapped, the homeless. On top of that, you've indicated that there are monumental health care costs on the horizon. It's a huge shopping list. Where do you draw the line? How do you make your choices? You can't have it all.
Well, I think you have to make your choices in a very practical way when you're in Washington voting on these questions. But I can tell you, I think we can have a heck of a lot more than we're getting today in this country if we spent less on national defense, so-called, which is just another way of saying participating in an arms race and not having the courage to stop it. If we had a tax system that was fairer and didn't give away the store as it has in many respects in the last few years, if we had budget priorities that made more sense, and that's why I fought for those things in the Congress. See, I think that the federal government has a very important role to play in ensuring that every person in this country has an opportunity. You know, we're not going to give everybody a job and give everybody a house and everybody a car, but we're going to give everybody a chance to achieve those things. And we are falling far behind in our efforts to give people those opportunities.
We can cut the budget. We can cut $50 billion from the military part of the budget. We can close $40 billion worth of tax loopholes. We have an underground economy of $100 billion. We can, in healthcare alone, if we kept it to the cost of inflation, we could save $55 to $77 billion. If we cut unemployment 1%, it saves $20 billion. We can, as Democrats, manage the economy, and we can shift the spending priorities to the programs that make sense in this country without raising new taxes. I have been a supporter of education. I continue to be a supporter of education, of environmental concerns, and what we can do is shift it. They're talking about $170, $190 billion deficit. That represents 5% of the gross national product. I remind them that in World War II, we had 25% of the gross national product was the deficit. So we can do this without raising new taxes, and that's what we should do. That's the way for decent social policy. Leave the money in the worker's pocketbook.
Kerry, I believe we can address those priorities, and I think it's a question of shifting the choices that we're currently making. One aircraft carrier, Nimitz class, is $3.5 billion. With all of the support aircraft and everything else, $35 billion. All we're asking in this country on an annual basis for the cleanup of acid rain over a 10-year period is $2 billion a year. We've cut less money from housing. We've gone from $24 billion down to $6. That money alone is contained in the defense cuts that are available, let alone the money we could save in agricultural subsidy reshifting, in underground economy, in the administrative savings that we have.
You would all argue that the money should come from the defense budget, and yet as one senator...
Not just the defense budget. We're looking at a number of potential areas. The Grace Commission reports that we can take as much as $70 to $90 billion from those who are tax cheaters. We had an amnesty program in this state that produced $65 million in new revenues. Just think what the application of that would be on the federal level. At the same time, a minimum corporate tax, and beyond that, the $50 billion cut within the defense budget. But at the same time, I think taxes go, I differ with my opponents dramatically on this issue, and that is I believe we ought to go straight tax simplification along the lines of Bradley Gephardt, where we go from the 13 tax categories down to 3. We keep the medical deduction, we keep the home mortgage deduction, and through that particular process, we make it possible for every American to actually file a report and not all the gobbledygook that exists.
What's wrong with such a tax system? Would you agree?
Well, I think that the thrust of it is reasonable enough, but you know, it does away with the child care credit, does away with the earned income credit, a lot of things that people like. And I think that the distribution, the other problem I have with it, you know, all that simplification I think is an important thing.
You created the great mess. You've been down there that's created the great mess in the tax system.
You know, you should...
And I can't believe you don't want to simplify.
You all should look at my record on these things, look at the votes I've cast, and look at the proposals I've made in alternative to the policies that have been adopted. As a matter of fact,
Jimmy, you can't keep being an insider and telling us now that you're the outsider. I mean, make up your mind. Either you're going to be the insider on the Ways and Means Committee who really knows the system, and now not take excuse for the tax system.
You know what, David, your friend Warren Brooks called me one of the brightest liberal tax reformers in the Congress, and he didn't mean it to be complimentary.
Let me ask you something about that, though, Jimmy, because when Reagan passed his tax, when he put in his tax cut proposals, one of the proposals was the Udall Amendment that the Democrats put up. The Udall Amendment said that people who earn more than $50,000 aren't going to get those breaks.
Right.
Everybody in our delegation voted for it except for you and Margaret Heckler.
Do you all support that Udall Amendment?
Yes.
You do. But let me tell you why. Let me tell you why you were wrong and why they were all wrong. They were wrong because Udall's proposal would have given the corporate tax breaks in the first year and made the individuals wait until the second and third year.
They would have gotten a break, Jimmy.
They wouldn't have gotten a break in the first year. They would have been playing catch up forever. And I took a position that the tax break should go to the individuals at the same time that it went to the corporations, and that we shouldn't let individuals wait while we gave big corporate tax breaks, which is what Udall wanted to do. I know he's a great liberal, John, but you don't vote in Washington by just looking at someone like Mo Udall and saying his proposal must be right. You analyze it, his proposal was wrong.
No, I disagree with you. Now let me say why.
On this particular phase of the question, I would like the opportunity to speak to the hazardous waste issue, and that would be my #1 priority in this particular campaign. Very simply, last Friday there was a poll conducted in the 7th Congressional District, and it showed that the #1 issue on voters' minds in the 7th was the issue of hazardous waste. On that very same day, I worked in a hazardous waste treatment plant in the town of Framingham. I worked on the loading dock, I worked in the lab, I worked in the shipping department, and it is an incredible issue that we have to deal with educationally. We have only fear. It is fear that we have to fear. And it is within that particular process that we have to be able to deal with it in a logical,
concerned about it. What do we do about it? Who should
fashion.
pay for the cleanup of hazardous waste?
Well, okay, I think that the issue of who should pay for the cleanup of hazardous waste is that the polluters clearly have to pay. They're the ones that should pay, the companies that are involved. I mean, I want to go on the issue that we were talking about with the liberal twins regarding taxes. And the truth of the matter is, since 1962, corporate America has seen its tax bill cut in half, from 24% to 12%. And part of the reason is the sophisticated lobby. We have the best Congress that money can buy. This is why people are unhappy with taxes. That's why people want not to pay any taxes. They are looking for fairness, and we haven't had fairness in that system, and I intend not to vote for any new taxes And as long as
even my proposal, I thought you supported my
Jimmy,
proposal.
not your proposal. Your proposal was the first time that you had something to say about corporate taxes.
You know, it's a funny thing. I proposed most of this in 1981, and it made its way into the Democratic bill, and it had the support of a lot of the business community, Small Business Association of New England.
How about Mass Mutual? Did they support
others
it too?
supported this proposal.
Mass Mutual support
And you
it?
realize if it, no, I'm afraid they didn't in 1981. But if we had put this into place in 1981, the deficit would be substantially less, the climate for growth would be better, and we'd have a lot healthier economy. And that's why I'm fighting for it again now.
Mr. Kerry.
Let John speak.
I wanted to come back for a minute. You want to have me speak?
I want to have you speak.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I want to come back for a moment, if I can, to the hazardous waste thing, because I think that that is an issue that, combined with all of the toxic waste, groundwater contamination, landfill problems, acid rain, the Reagan administration has stepped dangerously back from a major commitment that we made in this country to clean up. And we've gone in Massachusetts from some 284 EPA-funded positions down to 120, and yet we've picked up 36 new programs we're supposed to be monitoring. We have more groundwater contamination than at any time in history in this state. We have 9 communities whose wells have been shut, 36 communities where we have serious threat to the private wells and drinking water capacity. I don't think you can just turn to companies and say, you got to clean it up, because they're simply going to go out of business or go away, and that's part of the problem we have today. We need a national effort similar to the National Cost Sharing Program for cleanup of acid rain that is going to make this the national crisis that it is. And part of my disagreement with what is happening today is that it represents the same business as usual process where Washington
should not clean it up.
avoids responsibility.
Mr. Bartley?
Mary, that's magnificent rhetoric, and that's just what John is terrific at, okay? I used to do things and accomplish them. That's why we've got an Environmental Bill of Rights on the books. That's why we got an Endangered Species Act on the books. That's why we provided $325 million to clean up water. No one is going to stand up and say that they're in favor of acid rain. We've had a bill sitting up in the Massachusetts legislature for 9 months. Had I been the speaker, it would have been passed in January.
1 minute each.
That's the difference. Performance, not rhetoric.
Why didn't you clean it up when you were there?
Well, I tried very hard to do. We put the money in the water.
Now will have an opportunity, a minute and a half, to make a closing statement, one of the few formal parts of this debate. We begin with Mr. Shannon.
Thank you very much. You know, when I ran for Congress 6 years ago, people told me that it was going to be difficult filling Paul Tsongas's shoes. And they were right. It was difficult because he was a committed, effective congressman who spoke for the interests of Massachusetts and spoke for a better country for his children. I went there, and I think I did a pretty good job of filling his shoes. I fought for fairer taxes. I fought for a nuclear freeze. I fought for a better health care system. I sat there in 1981 and saw this administration try to dismantle the greatest program ever created in this country, the Social Security program, and I led the fight against that. And we've had some successes. We restored the minimum benefit. We put the child care credit in. We've got a disability bill now going to the president, which is going to restore some fairness to that system. And we're going to turn this country around on Central America and the arms race as well. But the point is, we need more than a voice in the United States Senate. We need a senator. We need somebody who can get the job done, who can deliver for Massachusetts. We need somebody who understands the greatness of this country, its potential, and the greatness of the potential of a United States Senator to change the direction of the country. It is that urgent, ladies and gentlemen, and this race in Massachusetts is that urgent. I want to run for the Senate, and I want to serve in the Senate to make those changes, to continue the work that I've begun in the House of Representatives, because I know how to get that job done. I know how to deliver. I'm qualified to be your senator.
All right, thank you, Mr. Shannon. The timekeeper tells me to go to Mr. Kerry next.
20 years ago, we had 20,000 nuclear warheads in this country. Today, we have 57,000, and I think no one outside of the Pentagon feels any safer. 20 years ago, we were fighting an unwinnable land war in Southeast Asia, and we lost over 57,000 American lives, some of them people I fought alongside. Today, we are prepared to make those same mistakes again in Central America or maybe elsewhere. 20 years ago, we began the struggle for civil rights, for human rights, for women's rights, to have clean air, clean water, to end poverty and ignorance. Yet today we have a government that pretends that those problems don't exist. I believe very deeply that there are a different set of choices for us in this country to prepare for the future. And if we make those choices, if we try to do better, there is nothing that we can't accomplish as a country because of our creativity, our capacity, and our daring. We can educate our kids. We can meet the challenge of the future. We can build schools. We can have decent housing. We can empower people of color. We can clean up toxic waste and hazardous waste. But we will only do it if we make the change in those priorities. As a veteran not only of Vietnam, but a veteran of many of those struggles, I want to go down to the United States Senate to fight against business as usual in Washington and to fight for a recommitment to peace and to justice.
All right, Mr. Conley is next.
As a United States Senator, I will serve in sharp contrast to Senator Ted Kennedy. I do not say that to be critical. Senator Kennedy has an international constituency, a national constituency, as well as a statewide constituency. I can cast informed votes on foreign affairs, whether it be Central America or the Mideast, but my #1 priority are the working men and women of Massachusetts. Over the last 11 weeks, I've worked in the shoe factory, I've worked on the docks, in the paper mill, as a policeman in the town of Shrewsbury. I am the individual who can represent these people on a series of issues. They want back to basics in education. They want a 21-year-old drinking age. They want drug and alcohol education in the 4th grade and 5th grade of their public school system. They want clean air. They want clean water. They want a solution to the hazardous waste problem. In some cases, we need import quotas. We need job training and retraining. And most of all, we need to make higher education accessible and available to everyone in this society. I will fight for all of those programs as a United States Senator, and there is a big difference between myself and the liberal twins. I support a bilateral nuclear freeze. They support nuclear disarmament. They are pro-abortion. I am pro-life. The mainstream Democrats in this state want to know that there's a future for themselves and a future for their families. Mike Conley represents that future. I thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Conley. Mr. Bartley?
The Democratic Party has always been the party of compassion, the party of heart, the party interested in education, in the elderly, party interested in the poor, and the party interested in taking care of people. The Democratic Party in Massachusetts is in danger of losing its compass. We can't just say that we're going to be the party of pro-abortion, pro-unilateral disarmament, and pro-new taxes. That's not the party of Franklin Roosevelt, John Kennedy, Harry Truman. John Kennedy cut taxes in 1962. He stimulated the economy. I think that we can operate this government without raising new taxes. We can operate the government without giving the store away to the Russians, as my two liberal friends have done. And we can operate this government without having a policy of saying that we are pro-abortion. I think that we've got to return to the traditional values that made this party great. And those were the values of being for education, for the elderly, for people who are in need. I've had a record of doing that as Speaker of the House that none of these gentlemen have had. I had the chance to run a budget, a $7 billion budget, provide a $42 million surplus, and do it as well as cutting taxes. David Bartley would like to take that record to Washington, and with your help on September 18th, I will. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Bartley, and our thanks to all 4 of the candidates for participating in tonight's forum, also to our live audience here at Faneuil Hall tonight, and to our viewing audience at home.
David Bartley and Michael Connolly spent time talking about their moderate to conservative politics in this state. David Bartley and Michael Connolly described both James Shannon and John Kerry as, quote, the liberal twins. David Bartley spent a lot of time talking about what is his principal campaign plank in terms of separating himself from the other candidates in this race. That is his no tax pledge. He repeated it on several occasions. Michael Connolly talked at great length about his jobs fair program. That is his attempt to go around the state and to learn about the concerns of working people. He talked about that quite frequently. But once again, it was the contest between James Shannon and Lieutenant Governor John Kerry that dominated this affair. There was some finger pointing, and there was definitely an aggressive assault of James Shannon's record in Washington, especially as it relates to the Mass Mutual tax break that he won for that company here, an $11 million break that James Shannon defended aggressively, said was very much needed by that company.